You've probably heard the story of D-Day 100 times, but always from the Allied side. And there's another side to that day that doesn't get talked about nearly as much. So, we're going to show you what that day looked like for the Germans, and why it was much darker than you might think. The story really begins with the fall of France in the summer of 1940. Germany launched its Western offensive on May 10th, and within 6 weeks, they had achieved what eluded them for 4 entire years during the First World War, and that was the complete defeat of France and push out British forces from the continent. Germany now controlled the entire Atlantic coastline from Norway all the way down to the Spanish border, roughly 5,000 kilometers of coastline facing Britain. Heavy coastal batteries were positioned near Killala, like Battery Linderman or Battery Todd, with 406 and 380mm heavy naval guns, all positioned to shell the English coast and protect against any future British operations across the narrow strait. Hitler expected Britain to recognize what he saw as their hopeless military position and negotiate peace. He actually respected the British Empire and preferred Britain as a potential ally rather than an enemy. But Churchill's government had other ideas. So on July 16, 1940, Hitler ordered preparations for Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain. But this quickly proved easier said than done. And after losing the Battle of Britain that was supposed to deliver air superiority, Hitler postponed Sea Lion indefinitely. He turned his attention east and launched Operation Barbarossa, leaving Britain deemed as not a major threat to German-controlled Europe. But then 2 things happened that would make the Germans change their mind. First came the commando raids. After Dunkirk, Churchill ordered the creation of commando forces to harass targets in occupied Europe. Starting in 1940, small British raids began hitting the Norwegian and French coasts, causing damage in German factories, sinking ships, and gathering intelligence. These raids proved that Britain could attack anywhere, along thousands of kilometers of coastline, and the Germans couldn't predict where or when the next raid would happen. Second, America entered the war. On December 11, 1941, 4 days after Pearl Harbor, Germany declared war on the United States. This now changed everything because American industry combined with their and British naval superiority meant that eventually at some point an invasion of occupied Europe would come. It was no longer a question of if, but when and where. So on March 23, 1942, Hitler demanded an impregnable fortress stretching from Norway to the Spanish border, about 2,400 kilometers of Atlantic coastline. The directive called for 15,000 concrete MP placements manned by 300 soldiers, and everything to be completed by May 1, 1943, which was a spectacularly unrealistic deadline. Nazi propaganda extensively assured Germans that the wall they were creating was impenetrable. But as you're about to see, the reality was a different story. They deployed 260,000 workers on Atlantic wall construction. However, the first mistake was that only 10% of them were German. The remainder were prisoners of war, concentration camp inmates, and civilians conscripted from occupied territories, who were working under far from ideal conditions. They were under SS supervision with limited tools and scarce food, sleeping on construction sites. Beatings and executions for disobedience were common, and over 185,000 deaths were recorded just during the construction of the Atlantic Wall and other defensive positions like the Freed Line. So quote-unquote unsatisfied workers fought back by passing intelligence to the French, resistance or sabotaging constructions. Germans were spending nearly 18 million cubm of concrete and 1.2 million tons of steel. The cost in France alone reached 3.7 billion Reichsmarks, which is roughly 26 billion in modern currency. But it was still far from enough. The wall itself was organized into 3 tiers. Vestungen were the heavily defended ports. Stützpunkte were secondary strong points, and Widerstands Nettor formed the lowest tier resistance nests, manned by 10 to 50 soldiers. And these resistance nests would bear the brunt of the invasion, as you're about to see. However, by the May 1943 deadline, only 6,000 of the planned 15,000 bunkers were complete, and only 510 of 2,000 planned positions were finished. Field Marshal von Rundstedt, who was inspecting the defenses, dismissed them as rubbish. RML went further, calling Hitler's Atlantic Wall strategy something that translates to cloud cuckoo land. And here is where the Germans made the next mistake. In November 1943, RML was appointed General Inspector of Western Defenses. He formally assumed command of Army Group B, which covered 1/300 mi of coastline, and already his first inspection shocked him. RML found all those holes in the system, from an insufficient number of troops over poorly constructed defenses, And two, most importantly, a complete lack of a uniform plan. So, in 5 months, RML drastically transformed the defenses by tripling laid mines to over 6.5 million. By May 1944, his engineers built over 4,600 fortifications and over 500,000 foreshore obstacles with over 30,000 of them fitted with mines and doubled concrete pouring. RML said the war would be won or lost on the beaches, and that their only chance to stop the enemy is while he's still in the water. He knew that the first 24 hours of the invasion would be decisive, but no one could have known how right he was going to be. While many German generals thought he was crazy, Rommel learned something in North Africa that they never experienced. He was nailed to the ground for days by the Allied Air Force, which convinced him that any counterattack moving toward the beaches would be destroyed from the air before it ever arrived. And so RML ordered 6 rows of obstacles like Czech hedgehogs, Belgian gates, and tetrahedra extending from above high tide to below low tide. However, only 3 were completed by June 6th. Wooden stakes, 8 to 10 feet tall, were stuck into beach sand at angles toward the sea and topped with Teller anti-tank mines, but many fell off before the invasion even began as saltwater corroded the attachment wires. Log ramps called Hembalken were designed to flip landing craft or detonate mines attached to them. By the way, these were shown wrong in Saving Private Ryan, as they were facing the sea instead of the beach. Now RML knew the defenses had to extend beyond the beaches, as Allies would land paratroopers and gliders behind German lines to attack from all directions and sabotage reinforcements. So he ordered wooden poles 4 to 5 meters tall stuck in the ground to deny gliders any safe landing zones. Poles were interconnected with tripwires at the top, and every third pole carried a mine or grenade. But when RML inspected these fields, he found the work had barely begun, and that out of 50 to 60 million mines he'd asked for, only about 6.5 million were placed. The 352nd Division defending Omaha Beach required 10 million mines alone for their 50-kilometer front, yet they received 10,000. RML was constantly calling and writing to Berlin complaining about shortages, but it made no difference. On top of all this, the German commanders couldn't even agree on how to use the forces they had. As Rommel argued to station the Panzer divisions right at the beaches and hit the Allies during their most vulnerable moment while in the water and under limited fire support, he knew that Allied air superiority would destroy any backup moving in daylight before it could even reach the beaches. Von Reunet, supported also by other German commanders, wanted to try an approach that worked on the Eastern Front and concentrate the Panzers far back inland, where they were safer from naval bombardment. Let the Allies land and only then launch a concentrated counterattack. Meanwhile, Hitler came with probably the worst possible idea and made a compromise that satisfied no one. Rommel received 3 Panzer divisions, while Hitler retained personal control of 4 elite divisions that couldn't move without his permission, meaning that neither general strategy could actually be implemented. But what about the soldiers themselves? The men waiting to counter the biggest invasion in history. Spring 1944 brought constant strain for soldiers stationed along the wall. They stared into the horizon through telemeters, knowing the invasion was coming, but having no idea where or when. And while we're talking about soldiers, the Atlantic Wall was not defended by Germany's finest, as their best units died on the Eastern Front. By 1944, their army in the West was made of soldiers, ranging from a few elite units to a barely functional collection of the old, wounded, foreign, and expendable, forming the majority of the defending force. The backbone of the Atlantic Wall garrison were the Bodeneiger Division, static divisions designed exclusively for fixed defensive positions, as they couldn't really walk too much. A large number of them were over 35 years old, some even well into their 40s and even 50, as others were soldiers recovering from wounds sustained on the Eastern Front, missing fingers, or suffering other chronic conditions like frostbite, etc. These divisions received a combat effectiveness rating of Kampfert 5, the lowest possible grade the German army assigned. They were also equipped mostly with captured weapons from across occupied Europe. But the strangest and most tragic element of the Atlantic Wall garrison were the Osttruppen, or the Eastern troops. According to historian Stephen Ambrose, 1 out of every 6 soldiers defending France on D-Day was not German. These men came from many different nationalities, all from German-occupied territories, and were imprisoned into improvised camps with barely any food or medical care. Many of them died just from horrible conditions. For example, About 3.3 million of 5.7 million Soviet prisoners died in German custody, so if they were given a choice to serve in German uniform, many quote-unquote volunteered for the OT battalion made of 90% former prisoners of war and 10% German officers keeping watch on them. Some volunteered out of genuine anti-communist conviction, while others simply wanted to live. So when D-Day came, many Austropens surrendered at the first opportunity, as they had no stake in defending Hitler's Europe. Not everyone defending the wall was second-rate, though. As the 352nd Infantry Division at Omaha Beach was a unit that would nearly stop D-Day. Formed in November 1943 from Eastern Front survivors, it had a little less than 7,000 battle-hardened combat troops. And most importantly, Allied intelligence never knew they arrived at Omaha. It was now June 5th, 1944, and everything looked like another quiet day for the Germans guarding the Atlantic Wall. Meteorologists predicted that weather conditions were far too bad for the Allies to fly or cross the channel safely, although everyone knew the invasion was inevitable and could come at any moment. Everything looked like it wasn't going to be this particular moment. With invasion judged impossible, commanders abandoned their posts, and Field Marshal Rommel left for Germany on June 4th to celebrate his wife's 50th birthday. Ironically, on June 6th, about half of commanders were away from their units. At his mountain retreat, Hitler watched newsreels, discussed films and theater, and talked into the small hours before retiring. His staff had strict orders not to wake him under any circumstances. Now, the Germans had spent years trying to figure out where the invasion would actually come, and the most logical answer was always Pas-de-Calais. It was the narrowest point of the channel, the shortest distance between England and France, and it offered the most direct route toward Germany itself. The Allies knew this is what the Germans were thinking, and they used it against them, creating a well-thought deception with fake armies, radio traffic, and equipment to convince German intelligence that Padala was indeed the target. However, the real invasion would come elsewhere, and the Germans would be looking the wrong way when it did. At 7 minutes past midnight on June 6th, German guards spotted low-flying aircraft near Omaha Beach. 4 minutes later, reports came in of enemy paratroopers landing, and by 12:30, reports of airborne operations deep inland reached higher headquarters. The sky was filling with aircraft, and no one knew yet whether this was the real thing or another smaller raid. At 1 in the morning, Marine radars picked up what they described as an important armada in front of Pardala, exactly where Germans expected the invasion to come. But at that very moment, Sergeant Ludwig Fair at Strongpoint, Oyen 6U, discovered the Allied fleet sitting just off Omaha Beach. 10 minutes later, all troops under 84th Corps were placed on alert, and by 1, General Dolman ordered a general alert for the entire 7th Army. At 10 minutes before 2 hours in the morning, Admiral Karl Hoffmann in Paris sent a message to Berlin reporting the invasion alert to the headquarters. And then came a catastrophic error. At 2:15, the 352nd Division ended its alert. 15 minutes later, fixed Allied transmitters with code names, bagpipe and chatter began jamming Marine and Luftwaffe communications. And from that point on, the confusion became overwhelming. Reports flooded headquarters from scattered locations with airborne troops reported here, aircraft spotted there, and paratroopers seemingly everywhere. But how many of these reports were real? You see, the Allies had dropped somewhere between 400 and 500 dummy paratroopers across Normandy in 4 separate operations. Allies called them Ruperts or Oscars, and the Germans called them Gummipuppen, which translates to rubber dolls. These dummies had hidden explosive charges that detonated on impact, destroyed the evidence, and made it seem like a paratrooper burned his chute upon landing, which was standard practice. When German patrols investigated, they found only empty parachutes and no bodies. Sound devices called pint tails were dropped as well that simulated rifle fire and created additional chaos through the night. But among those decoys also landed 12 men from the 2nd SAS Regiment, who were the first unit to land on D-Day, 10 minutes ahead of planned time, beating Major Howard's famous glider force at Pegasus Bridge. These SAS teams carried gramophones and amplifiers with pre-recorded battle sounds, like shouting commands, rifle fire, and explosions that lasted about 30 minutes. They deliberately let some Germans escape, so they would spread panicked reports of parachute landings. Out of these 12 SAS men, only between 1 and 3 survived, depending on sources. They were either killed during the operation or later executed after capture. Throughout the night, the actual airborne assault was creating its own chaos. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions dropped over 13,000 paratroopers over the Cotentin Peninsula, but bad weather, intense anti-aircraft fire, and pilot navigation errors scattered them across 25 mi of Norman countryside. Many landed in areas the Germans had deliberately flooded as a defensive measure and drowned. But this made the confusion even bigger, as Germans couldn't determine where the attack was coming from. What was the actual size of the airborne force, or which reports were real or fake? The German headquarters saw it as a massive, widespread attack that seemed impossible to counter. At 5:45, the naval bombardment began while it was still dark. 5 minutes later, the ships switched to their pre-assigned beach targets. As gray light began spreading across the channel, German soldiers along the coast saw a huge incoming fleet of over 200 warships, 4,000 landing craft, 700 ancillary craft, and 850 merchant vessels. Just under 7,000 vessels in total. Nothing like it was ever seen before, and nothing like it was seen since, at least for now. 5 battleships, 20 cruisers, and 65 destroyers began shelling the coast, blowing up defenses and fortifications together with their defenders. So, when the sun rose at 6 in the morning, the defenders finally saw the whole Allied fleet sitting offshore. Reinforcements realized they were completely out of position, spread across the countryside. They had spent the night chasing rubber dolls while the real invasion began at the beach. At Omaha Beach, though, the bombing had little effect, as poor visibility made Allied bombers drop their bombs too far inland to avoid hitting their own troops. The German defenders at Omaha were relieved to hear the bombing stop. With everything still in place, WN-62 was the largest strongpoint at Omaha, positioned above the beach with a garrison of 40 soldiers. It was armed with 2 bunkers housing 75mm guns, a 50mm anti-tank gun, 2 50mm mortars, and multiple MG-42s, MG-34s, and water-cooled MG-08s. The position also had flamethrowers and a spotting post that could call in artillery fire from a gun battery at Hooterville, 5 km inland. When the first Higgins boats dropped their ramps at 6 in the morning, the men of WN-62 were ready. Henrik Seo was 20 years old that morning and found himself manning an MG-42 at WN-62, positioned 450 meters from where the first wave would land. His commander, Lieutenant Bernhard Firking, told soldiers to open fire when the enemy is knee-deep in the water and still unable to run quickly. By his own account, there were definitely at least 1,000 men in front of him, most likely more than 2,000, but he didn't know how many he actually shot. He described it as awful, saying that just thinking about it made him want to throw up. He said he emptied an entire infantry landing craft by himself, turning the sea red in that area, while an American officer shouted hysterically through a loudspeaker. SEO claims to have fired over 13,000 MG-42 rounds that day and another 400 rifle rounds. However, total confirmed American casualties across the entire 10 km of Omaha Beach were somewhere around 2,500 men, and there were 15 strong points, with 85 machine guns firing that morning, with mortars and artillery joining in as well. So Seo couldn't have possibly inflicted 1,000 or 2,000 casualties by himself. But his number was just a rough estimate in that chaotic situation. He later surrendered, but made sure not to reveal that he was a machine gunner. Years after the war, Seo tracked down a man named David Silva, an American who had been wounded by tracer rounds on Easy Red Sector. Since Seol was the only German firing traces at that position, he knew he was the one who shot him. Their reunion led to a lifelong friendship, and both men returned to Normandy together for reconciliation ceremonies in the decades that followed. Franz Gockel was even younger than Seo, just 18 years old, when he manned a water-cooled Polish MG-08 at WN-62. He said he couldn't understand why the Americans kept pushing forward, even as they were being cut down by machine gun fire. Around 8 in the morning, Gall's machine gun was destroyed by a direct hit and 2 fingers were shot off his hand. He defended himself with only a pistol until noon, when he surrendered. From the German perspective, the morning at Omaha was actually a success, at least for those first few hours. The first wave of about 8 companies was instantly cut down, and for a short while, it looked like the Atlantic War was doing exactly what it was designed to do. But then the tide began to turn. The strongpoints were now running out of ammunition, and seeing what was going on with soldiers on the beaches, American destroyers moved in within 1,000 yards of the beach, risking grounding so they could fire directly into bunkers and trenches that were cutting down waves of the attack force. This bought time for the American soldiers to reach the fortifications and clear them out with flamethrowers. At around 2:30 in the afternoon, The UN-62 completely ran out of ammo and found itself outflanked by American troops who had now made it up the cliffs. The strong point was finally overrun and most of its defenders were killed. At the other beaches, the German experience varied a lot, but generally went worse than at Omaha because they were hit by much more accurate bombardment. At Utah Beach, the Americans accidentally landed about radio center south of their intended position, accidentally missing the most heavily defended area, so resistance fell apart quickly. Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches were defended by the 716th Static Division, and resistance varied from place to place. Germans on Gold Beach fought fiercely from houses along the coast and held out for hours. Juno saw fierce initial resistance with 1/3 of the landing craft hitting mines and nearly half of all Canadian casualties occurring in the first hour alone. But once British specialized armor arrived for clearing mines, engineering vehicles called Avery and amphibious Sherman tanks, the German positions were taken out one by one. So while German soldiers were frantically trying to stop the waves of Allied soldiers, the German command structure that was supposed to coordinate their defense had completely collapsed from the very start of the invasion. Like we said, RML was hundreds of kilometers away in Germany celebrating his wife's birthday, unreachable by phone. Hitler was asleep at his mountain retreat, and his staff had strict orders not to wake him. And they didn't dare even when it was obvious that the invasion began. Von Runert, commanding all German forces in the West, couldn't release the reserve divisions without Hitler's personal permission, and General Feuinger, who commanded the 21 St. Panzer Division, was in Paris that night with his mistress without anyone even knowing. Confused chains of command caused problems at every level, and the men actually doing the fighting had no idea that the whole system above them had basically stopped working within the most critical time window when they actually had some chance to stop the invasion. When Hitler finally woke up, the invasion had been ongoing for about 6 hours. It was said that Hitler actually looked as if a great burden had fallen from his shoulders, relieved that the long-anticipated invasion had finally come. But then came a decision that would now prove completely catastrophic for his forces in Normandy. Hitler dismissed the landings as a decoy to draw German forces away from the real invasion, which he was still convinced would come at Pas-de-Calais. At around 4 in the afternoon, more than 12 hours after the first paratrooper landings and nearly 10 hours after the beach landings began, Hitler finally released the 12th SS Panzer Division and the Panzerlehr Division to move toward Normandy, still convinced that the main invasion was to come at Pardala. For weeks after D-Day, he was always reluctant to commit his best forces to what he believed was just a distraction. 19 divisions of about 150,000 men sat waiting at Pas-de-Calais for 2 weeks for the real invasion that never came. First units from now released divisions didn't even reach their gathering point until 10 at night, way past the critical window that Rommel had warned about. By late afternoon on June 6th, the German defense had collapsed completely. The Panther Tank Battalion ran out of fuel and couldn't move at all, and the division didn't actually engage Allied forces until 10 in the morning on June 7th. A full day after the invasion started, when the beachheads were already established and expanding. RML himself found out about the invasion at 10:15 on the morning of June 6th. By the time he rushed back to France and reached his headquarters, all 5 Allied beachheads were already established, and there was nothing he could do to throw them back into the sea. The 24 hours he had warned about were already gone. The Luftwaffe was virtually non-existent over the beaches, with only 2 German aircraft managing to strafe the landing areas on D-Day, and the reserves everyone argued about for months were held too far back and released too late to make any difference whatsoever. Total German casualties on D-Day itself are estimated somewhere between 4,000 and 9,000, though the exact number is unclear since it's hard to tell which soldiers were killed, captured, or went missing in the chaos. By the end of June 6th, over 150,000 Allied troops were ashore in France. A month later, that number had grown to 875,000, and Germany was now beyond the point of return. By the time the Normandy campaign finally ended in late August 1944, Germany had lost 320,000 men in total, with 30,000 killed, 80,000 wounded, and 210,000 listed as missing or captured. 27 of their 38 divisions in the region were completely wiped out. RML was right all along. The war in the West was decided in the first 24 hours.